Hello, apes. Welcome back to our online lessons for AP Environmental Science. So my name is Dr. Sowell, and I teach apes down here in Jacksonville, Florida. So before we jump into today's work with ocean warming and ocean acidification, I do want to point out some new updates that we just found out about the upcoming AP exam. Now, your AP teachers will have a lot more information, and you'll probably see some more information and details posted on the College Board website. Excuse me. But I just wanted to go over a few things that we do know at this point. So you know at this point that you'll be taking it at home, but the date of the exam is Monday, May 18th at 4 o'clock Eastern time. It's going to cover units 1 through 7, so as laid out in the course exam and description. No multiple choice, we knew that already, and there's no math. So let me back up a little bit. You do not need a calculator. So you may see some quantitative data in graphs or charts or other means, but you won't actually have to do any calculations yourself. You may need to look at that data and make some inferences or explanations based on that data, but you won't have to do any mathematical calculations per se. Then we've got 2 FRQs that we know is going to be on the exam. The first one is going to mimic the way the first FRQ was described in the course exam and description booklet. It's the design and investigation FRQ. So there's going to be some type of experimental design aspect to part of that question. They will be asking you other things, and you'll have to do other skills in that first question, but it is all framed around a scientific investigation, and that's 25 minutes to do the question and 5 minutes to upload your response. That 5 minutes to upload your response, you will get more detail on what that really means a little bit later on. But to answer the question, it's 25 minutes. FRQ number 2, that's 15 minutes, and this is called the Analyze an Environmental Problem and Propose a Solution FRQ. So both of these FRQs, number 1 and number 2, focus on some specific skills. So Ms. Fassler and I have been talking about these practices and skills over and over and over again. Well, now that we know which FRQs are being tested, we're going to narrow our focus to some of the specific skills associated with those 2 FRQs. It's not going to be a big difference than what we've been doing so far. We're just going to get a little bit more myopic and focused on which ones we talk about. So that is an update on the exam. And again, check with your instructor, check the College Board website for more details. And I'll share more as we go along. So let's just kind of warm up our brains here. So Ms. Fassler did an insanely good job the other day talking to us about greenhouse gases and climate change. And she talked about the idea of more heat being trapped into our atmosphere. I want to see if you can translate that information over into thinking about the oceans now. So this question says, which of the following best describes the primary cause of global ocean warming? So take 30 seconds or so and choose the correct answer. All right, so hopefully you picked D, an increased global temperature from an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this goes right back to Ms. Fassler's conversation the other day. In fact, I just grabbed a screenshot of her lecture as I was listening to it. She did a really fantastic job talking about these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, CFCs, and water vapor, and how these 5 gases re-radiate heat back down into our Earth's atmosphere. So while certain wavelengths of energy can pass right through, this heat energy, this different kind of wavelength is bounced back and creates a more warm planet, and the results in climate change. So here's what we're going to do today. Here's our goals. So our 2 content goals are number 1, to discuss ocean warming, and number 2, to discuss the issue of ocean acidification. These are very 2 unique systemic changes to our oceans that have some very specific and measurable changes that we'll talk about today. While doing so, we're going to look at these 2 practices: concept explanation. Can you articulate an understanding of an environmental concept in written form and make it sound like you've taken the course, not just memorize some facts? And second of all is this practice of scientific experiments. Can you design your own experiment to perhaps investigate an environmental issue, or can you interpret somebody else's experiment and pick apart some of the unique things that they did in their experiment process, their methods? So just before we start, I always like to start by kind of thinking about how this ties into some other units. And so some things that I thought about today was clearly aquatic biomes. We're looking at the ocean. And this comes from Unit 1, Topic 3, carbon cycle. You obviously saw this with Ms. Fassler yesterday, and we'll continue to involve the carbon cycle in particular here with our two topics. And then also, again, that notion of ecological tolerance. That's popped up in 2 or 3 times so far because it is such a great tool to explain the effects on species of different environmental changes. So here's what we need to know for this first topic, 9.6. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the causes and the effects of ocean warming. So to get there, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to describe why those greenhouse gases are causing ocean warming, and then we'll look at some very specific effects of ocean warming on marine species. So Ms. Fassler mentioned the other day this very historic record, 800,000 years ago, of kind of paleoclimate. And we can see upswings and downswings with carbon historically through time. But then we have this era in our modern times from 1950 beyond, really, where we see this big spike in carbon dioxide levels. And Ms. Fassler also showed you the Keeling Curve. So this is our modern standard of record keeping for the carbon dioxide concentrations over Hawaii. And so we can see the concentrations of carbon dioxide, the ppms, parts per million, increasing over time. And Ms. Fassler also pointed out uniquely that the rate of change is different. She looked at the slope of the line. So back here in the 60s, it was averaging about 1 part per million per year. So it was going 1 part per million per year up. Now, in more modern decades, we're looking at almost 10 parts per million, or I'm sorry, 3 parts per million per year. So the rate has gotten higher. And again, the result of that is this enhanced greenhouse effect, global warming, and climate change. So the next logical step to take, if we're talking about oceans, is a warmer atmosphere is going to result in a warmer ocean. Why? More greenhouse gases are going to trap that heat within the atmosphere. And because 70%, over 70% of our Earth is covered in oceans, a lot of that heat is simply going to be absorbed by the oceans. Atmosphere heat transferred into ocean heat. And here clearly is one of our pieces of content knowledge from the curriculum guide. Ocean warming is caused by the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So changes in the atmosphere causing changes in the ocean. So in particular, we're going to take a look now at sea surface temperature. This is the temperature of the ocean in the upper few meters of water. And if we just look at the anomalies from January and December from 1880 all the way up to 2020, you can clearly see there's much more of a positive anomaly, some increases in temperature in more recent times, and the overall trend is increasing. So why do we care? I think Ms. Fassler did a great job the other day of talking about why we care if the atmosphere is hotter, if the planet is hotter. Now we're going to drill down and go, well, who cares if the ocean is a little bit warmer? Well, it has some very clear effects. Ocean warming can affect marine species in a variety of ways, including loss of habitat and metabolic and reproductive changes. So again, going back to that range of tolerance that we talked about before, let's pretend I'm one of these little soldier fish right here, and I am existing in my optimal temperature. I'm swimming around, doing my thing, being a good little soldier fish, and I can survive, I can grow, I can reproduce. I'm thriving in this optimal abiotic condition of temperature. But if it gets a little too cold or a little too warm, I may be able to survive and grow okay, but maybe I'm not reproducing as well. Maybe my spawning activities have been altered, or breeding cues have been altered because of temperature. And then if we go even further on the left or the right, maybe I'm just hanging in there. I'm not really thriving or reproducing or growing. I'm just barely hanging in there. And if I go beyond my range of tolerance, I can't exist there. Now, if I'm a fish and there's habitat elsewhere, perhaps I can move to avoid those extremes or those temperature anomalies outside of my range of tolerance. But if I'm something that is in a fixed position, let's say a coral, I'm going to have to stay there and either weather it out or not make it. So I'm going to show you some images without a lot of labels on them, just to see if we can find a pattern in these images. So I'm going to start with this. This is from 1967 on the northeastern coast of the North Atlantic Ocean, and you'll see some clear spots and some purple heavy concentration spots. And if we compare that with 1967 to 1990, we see that this purple stuff, whatever it's measuring, is going from being kind of evenly distributed along this range to being a little bit more concentrated up here and hardly anything down here. And then if we jump to 2014, we see the vast majority of this purple stuff in the north. Well, what this is measuring is the number of lobsters caught by lobster fishermen. So warming ocean temperatures is pushing the lobster population north. So the temperatures down here in 2014 is outside of the optimal range of tolerance for temperature for these lobsters, and they're moving north to colder waters. So again, this is not just about fish moving to other locations. This has some very real consequences. So it can affect metabolic rates. It might be altering when certain species reproduce. Sometimes those cues for spawning are temperature related. Habitat loss, we'll talk a lot about that today in terms of coral reef, but also temperature can affect the sex of an offspring. Sea turtles, for example, their determination of male or female can sometimes be affected by temperature. But what we're going to focus a lot of our attention on today is coral reefs. Coral reefs are being dramatically impacted by both of the things we're talking about today, warming oceans and acidic oceans. And so we'll first talk about how warming oceans affect them. So when we look at this coral reef, just take a second and stare at it and you'll see, I mean, it's beautiful. We have lots of different coral colors. We see some fish. So the biodiversity seems pretty high, but you'll also notice this is pretty shallow water, low turbidity. And that typically means that the organisms there are going to require some sunlight. And that's going to become important in a minute. So coral reefs are important for a lot of reasons, and they are a good place to kind of practice some of the ideas that we've mentioned earlier in the course. So concepts of biodiversity or of species richness, and then just the dynamics of a food web and all of those trophic levels and energy transfers within this complex community. NPP, net primary productivity, would come into play here, and also symbiosis. And the symbiosis is a concept we'll look at next. So this is what a coral looks like. So a coral polyp is an individual, tiny, soft-bodied polyp. And it's got these little tentacles on the top, and these tentacles will grab plankton and eat it up. But that only composes a small amount of their energy needs and food needs. The majority of their food comes from this photosynthetic algae that is living as a symbiotic relationship inside the tissues of the polyp. So it would be as if I had algae in my skin and I could walk outside and get in the sunlight and feel full. It would be feeding me. So the algae has a great place to live, and the coral gets some of the nutrients from the photosynthesis of the algae. So it's a great symbiotic relationship, and they cannot live optimally without each other. So I do want to point out two other things. If you'll notice here at the bottom, it says a skeleton. So if you think about a coral reef, they're kind of these large mounds or hills of coral. Well, actually, the only thing that's alive on that are the top layers of coral. That's these living polyps with their symbiotic algae. Underneath that is the calcium carbonate skeleton that they have excreted. So this little polyp excretes this calcium carbonate shell to hold it in place. And then the next generation will cover that. And then the next generation will cover that, so that the outside has this living layer of polyps with the calcium carbonate skeleton underneath. All right, so how does this happen? So we've got dissolved CO2 in the water. We talked the other day about DO, dissolved oxygen. Well, there's dissolved carbon dioxide as well, obviously. There's photosynthesis and full food webs going on underneath the water, and carbon is a big part of that. So CO2 is going to be dissolved in the water. Well, what these organisms do, they take that carbon in the form of carbonate, so carbonate ions, combine that with calcium to make calcium carbonate. That's where the shells come from. So you can see here as a picture of a bivalve, and their shells are made out of calcium carbonate. Over time, with pressure and heat, this could form into some sedimentary rock like limestone. And this is a really big carbon sink. A lot of the carbon is stored long-term in something like limestone rock. So unfortunately, we have an event, a phenomenon called coral bleaching that is becoming quite common and disastrous for coral reefs. So if you'll notice this picture on the left, high biodiversity, very colorful. We see other organisms, looks like a pretty healthy coral reef. We look at this right side, we see bleached coral. It's all white. The color is gone. But in addition to the color, the other species have gone as well. The biodiversity radically goes down. So our goal now is to figure out why, what's going on here. So I'm going to show you a video clip now, and I really want you to, as you're watching this, determine two things. What are the causes of this bleaching event, and then the effects of the bleaching?
Corals are small animals, but they build structures that you can actually see from space. As we zoom in, we see the reefs where I work, on a little island called Ofu in American Samoa. The ridge there, the edge, is the coral reef. And as we zoom in, we see what those reefs are. Now, the reefs are made of individual coral colonies, like we see now. That coral, then, is actually made up of a whole series of small polyps, they're called. This is a colonial organism, and the polyps themselves have all the structures that an animal needs. It has a mouth, it has tentacles, it has gonads, it can live, it can reproduce, it can grow. They're in a colony of genetically identical polyps. Now, the color on these tentacles, like I said, is not the color of the coral itself. It's the color of the symbiont. And as the focus racks in and out a little bit here, then what we see is that we can just see the little globules of the symbiont. Well, let's take a closer look. We'll go into a tentacle and see those. These cells, the symbionts, are not just floating around. They're actually inside the coral cells. Corals are simple, they just have two cell layers, an epidermis and a gastrodermis inside. The symbionts are inside the gastrodermis, and you can see it there. Now this is a life form called a dinoflagellate.
So that dinoflagellate, that is the algae. So this is the algae living within the cells of the coral polyp.
It has chloroplasts because it's photosynthetic, but it has very odd shaped chloroplasts, like these yellow structures here. We're going to zoom in to the chloroplast itself because that's where the damage happens during bleaching. What do chloroplasts have in them? They have membranes called thylakoid membranes. Those membranes hold the proteins called the photosystems that then capture light energy and turn it into chemical energy. It's the molecules that turn all of the sunlight that we get on the planet into the food that we eat. The rain of photons down here hits these photosystems and they gather them up. Now, if the temperature goes up and if the light goes up, then they freak out. There's too much energy, the photosystems break, and they no longer can function the way they do. But the rain of photon keeps going. The energy is still there, and as a consequence, that energy is now turned into reactive oxygen molecules. Those are damaging to cells, so it damages the inside of the symbiont, it damages the inside of the coral cell, and they spit the symbiont out. That spitting of the symbiont out by one coral cell isn't bad, but if the entire colony does it, then that's coral bleaching. What you can see here is simulated of the spitting out of these symbionts and the gradual whitening of this particular part of this particular coral colony. Well, when that happens across an entire colony, then the coral turns from its normal tan color into a white color. What difference does that make? The symbiont provides 75 to 80% of the energy the coral needs to survive, and without that energy, it can't make a skeleton and it can't live very long. So as a consequence, a lot of the corals that bleach eventually die.
So we just heard there 75 to 80% of the energy that coral reef uses on a moment-to-moment basis is coming from that symbiotic algae living within their tissues. And if coral bleaching is happening from temperatures, it's a bad situation for the coral reef. So the content standard says ocean warming is caused by coral bleaching. Or ocean warming is causing coral bleaching, which occurs when the loss of algae within corals cause the corals to bleach white. Some recover and some die. So here we get to a really interesting part of this story is, are all corals at risk? I mean, is this happening everywhere to all corals, the same degree, the same way? So what we're going to do now is explore a data set to look at that. Now, although this unit will not be tested on the AP exam, this type of scenario is fair game. So we're looking at a situation, we're looking at an environmental problem, and now we're going to step back and look at some data to help us understand it a little bit better. So that skill of interpreting visual representations or data sets is a skill that may be applied to the FRQs that you have to do on the exam. So again, our question now is, to what degree is this happening? Is it bad all over? And how can some recover and some not? So we're going to go to Egypt. So there is a great coral reef in the Red Sea off the coast of Egypt in Hurghada, Egypt. And we're going to look at the sea surface temperatures there in the Red Sea, because if we know coral bleaching is associated with temperature, we should be looking at temperature changes in the ocean as part of our data set. So this is a graph from Hurghada, Egypt, from 2001 to 2002. And you can see here that the maximum monthly mean temperature is 29.8 degrees Celsius. That means the average hottest temperature in this location is 28.9 degrees Celsius. So if that's the average hot temperature, if I'm a coral reef living down here, all is good, all is good, all is good. Ugh. This is going to be some heat stress here. This is where I'm going to be at risk of bleaching. So we see it happen here during July and August of 2001. And in the fall and the winter and the spring, it goes back down. But in the summer, it peaks up again a little bit here and then goes back down. So scientists are really interested in these two moments because this is where the heat stress is going to happen and potentially bleach the coral. So we can zoom in on those two data points and kind of blow them up a little bit to take a little deeper look at them. So if we compare what's going on in 2001 to 2002, we can see that 2001 looks like it lasts a little longer. The x-axis are weeks. So this is lasting a little bit over a month, about a month. And the highest change in temperature is a good complete degree from 28.9 to 29.9. So during this time, this coral reef in Hurghada, Egypt experienced a month-long warming event, and it was pretty high, almost a full degree at times. The following year is a little less longer in duration and usually only about a half a degree. So why does that matter? In this situation on the right, it was probably about a bleaching possible. So this was a possible bleaching. However, this lasted long enough and high enough that bleaching was actually probably likely. Now, corals can recover their symbionts. If the temperature goes back down, they can reabsorb those algae symbionts and resume being a healthy coral. But if that temperature lasts too long and it's too high, that's a permanent ejection of the symbionts, and then the coral reefs don't make it. So here is a list of 28 reefs total, and Hurghada, Egypt is one of them right here. So this is the list of the reefs, and in this kind of colored 3 rows here is the degree of coral bleaching. So No bleaching really only occurred in one little spot right here in Hawaii. Everywhere else either said that bleaching was possible, likely, or mortality was likely. So let's take a look and see if we see any trends in mortality likely. So if we just scan through these three columns, just on a quick visual capacity, we can see that there's more red as we go to the right. And in fact, in 2002, there's about 32% mortality likely. In 2010, 46, and 2014, 54%. Now again, on this year's AP exam, you will not be asked to do calculations, but you should be able to look at trends and to understand changes in the data. So we're seeing not only do the coral bleaching happening, but we're seeing it happen more often in more places to the extent that mortality is likely. And if you want to look for a really great example of how impactful this is, look at some of the articles about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. Really dramatic and saddening news there. So we've got this situation where we've bleached this coral out. We've dropped the biodiversity down really, really low. These corals are not going to recover. But so what? Well, really, this coral reef, like I said, is the habitat for many, many other species. It's breeding grounds for species. It's part of the food web. So this is going to have a really dramatic effect on the entire ecosystem there. So the standard says ocean warming is causing coral bleaching, which occurs with the loss of algae within corals, causing them to bleach white. Some recover and some die. So hopefully we've gotten through those ideas there. I do want to point out some very significant economic consequences. If I am this local fisherman and I am relying on the coral reef and the fish that live there for my livelihood, for my money that I live on, bleaching events are going to have a very negative impact on local fisheries, on my economic survival. So I want to go now and look a little bit at the scientific experiment practice. So again, these, as with all practices, get more and more complex as we go through. So the first stage is, what's the purpose? What's the testable question or the hypothesis for the experiment? And then B and C really talks about what are their methods? How are they designing the experiment? I will point out that 4D is not assessed on the exam. That's because this is the kind of stuff that you would do in your classroom when you're actually making your own empirical observations. And then finally, the last part is, well, what could you do different to alter your results or to get different results? Kind of tweaking the experiment at the end. What I'm going to ask you to do is look at these three in particular. Can we identify the hypothesis or testable question? And then can we dissect and describe some of the methods used in an experiment? So to do so, we're going to look at an experiment from Dr. Palumbi. He is a researcher who studies coral reefs and is very particularly interested in the issue of coral bleaching. So he works in Ofu in American Samoa. He was the gentleman narrating the animation we just saw. And one of the things he noticed there that some lagoons were naturally warmer than others. So if you think about lagoons off of a beach, some are deeper, some are more shallow, some might get more sunlight than others. So some pools were just naturally a little bit warmer than others. And so he also noticed that in those warm pools, the corals seemed fine. They weren't being bleached out. So he designed an experiment to kind of figure out what was going on there. So I'm going to show you a clip, about a 2.5-minute clip. And as you're going through this, see if you can start to identify things like his testable question or his hypothesis, and can you kind of describe some of his experimental methods?
Coral reefs are one of the most spectacular ecosystems found in nature. Host to numerous biological communities, they are important havens of biodiversity. And a valuable food source for over 500 million people. But as Earth's climate warms, so do the oceans, bringing heat stress to coral communities. When water temperatures get too warm, coral species may respond by expelling their symbiotic algae in a process called bleaching. Repeated or prolonged bleaching can lead to the death of entire coral colonies. Marine biologist Steve Palumbi is studying how different coral populations respond to heat stress caused by warming oceans. He regularly travels to Ofu, a tiny island in Samoa, for his fieldwork.
Ofu Island and the lagoon behind the reef here is one of the best coral laboratories in the world. These back reef lagoons heat up to an extraordinary degree for a coral reef. They heat up to 32, 33, 34 degrees centigrade. That's above the temperature at which most corals will bleach and die, yet these lagoons are full of thriving, growing corals of many, many species. So the question is, how do these corals do it? How do they live in such warm temperatures?
To answer these questions, Palumbi and his colleagues conducted a controlled experiment, devising a way to apply heat stress to the corals in the lab.
First, we had to build a standardized stress tank so that we could expose corals from different parts of the reef to exactly the same stress.
Palumbi took corals of the same species from two different parts of the reef, one living in a warmer pool of water and the other in a cooler pool, and put them in the stress tanks. When grown and measured in these tanks, corals from the warmer pool were more resistant to bleaching.
So let's kind of see if we can analyze that a little bit. So for the first part of this science practice, it says identify a testable hypothesis or scientific question for an investigation. So let's think about the scientific question. So take 15 seconds or so and think to yourself, what was the purpose of that experiment? What question was he trying to answer? So the way I wrote it was, how does heat stress affect corals based on where they were previously living, either in a warmer pool or a cooler pool? And then in terms of the variables, the independent and dependent variables, take a second and think if you could define those two. So our independent in this case would be the home pool, whether or not they grew up in the cold or the cooler pool or the warmer pool. But the dependent variable is the amount of bleaching. How did they respond to the heat stress? And finally, what variables or what factors did he control throughout the experiment? So you could mention things like the living conditions. He set up the exact same cooler in the exact same way with the same type of water, used the same lamps, the same degree of heat stress. So everything was kept the same except for which pool they came from. So let's go back to Dr. Palumbi for another minute and have him talk through those results a little bit more.
So this is the lab that we have built in American Samoa. It may not look like much, but it's actually an incredibly important facility for us because we've been able to standardize the heat stress that we can apply to corals. We can provide them with a mimic of the kinds of heat they'll get actually on an Ofu coral reef and see how they react. So these tanks actually have heaters and chillers in them. They have lights. They have flow-through water system. They're controlled by that laptop on the right-hand side. And we can use those little tanks to mimic what these corals will see during a very strong bleaching day out there in Ofu. Well, what do we see? We see this. We see corals that come out of the same tank looking very different. The coral on your left is bleached. It's lost most of its symbionts. The coral on the right, though, is not bleached. It came out of the same tank. It got the same heat. It's the same species. The only difference is that the coral on your left was living in a very cool part of the reef, but the coral on the right, same species, was living in a warmer part of the reef. So we know from this that different corals react differently to the same bleaching temperatures. Some bleach, like they're predicted to, but some are resistant to that. So the question that we really began to ask is, how do they do that? How do corals become resistant to bleaching? Does it happen quickly? Can all corals do that? That's why OFU has been a really important research site for this.
So what he is getting at is that some of these corals that have grown up or that have evolved to exist in these warmer pools may have a range of tolerance for temperature that is different from others. And so looking exactly how that happens in terms of acclimation versus adaptation is a unique thing that he talks about later on in the video that if you wanted to peek at, you could. But the focus here is to understand the bleaching event itself. So that's ocean warming, and our phenomenon that we really anchored that on is coral bleaching. Now we're going to look at our second topic, 9.7, and this is on ocean acidification, and the goal is for you to explain the causes and effects of ocean acidification. So to get there, we're going to first describe the relationship between carbon dioxide and the acidity of the ocean. And then we'll look at some anthropogenic changes or anthropogenic activities that's causing this problem, and then look at some very specific effects, again, looking at corals and some other shellfish. So this is coming from last year's exam. So last year's FRQ number 3 says, the graph shows measurements of atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii and measurements of pH in the ocean nearby at Station Aloha. Measurements of pH began in 1992. So here's a graph, and this is what you're presented with at the beginning of the question. So we can see that on the y-axis, we have carbon dioxide parts per million, so the concentration of carbon dioxide. The years are on the x-axis down here, and we see this up, down, up, down, up, down little wiggly line, but the trend is to get higher and higher and higher. So we can clearly see the carbon dioxide is increasing. But then the other little data set built into the same graph is pH. So from about 1992, the pH has also been measured in a wiggly, wiggly, wiggly line, but the trend is to decrease. Now those up, down wiggles are seasonal variations based on photosynthesis, but the overall trend is what we're interested in. CO2 is increasing, pH is decreasing. So we know that the ocean is a huge part of the carbon cycle. So NOAA says the ocean plays a critical role in the carbon storage. It holds about 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. And so we can see that the carbon diffuses really easily into the ocean. So what's the main effect of that additional CO2? So having more CO2 in the atmosphere results in more CO2 into the ocean. And when it's absorbed by that water, it forms carbonic acid. And here is the chemical equation that represents that event. So carbon dioxide plus water yields carbonic acid. And there's the written form of that same equation. So therefore, the pH decreases from the addition of the carbonic acid. So more CO2 in the air results in more CO2 dissolved into the ocean, which results in the formation of more carbonic acid, which drops the pH. This phenomenon is called ocean acidification. Okay, so we've got ocean warming, and now we have ocean acidification. So what's going on here is this carbonic acid is causing problems with shelled organisms uploading calcium carbonate into their shells or their exoskeletons. So we've got this excess CO2 creating excess carbonic acid in the ocean. And this carbonic acid is going through some chemical equations or some processes that really just steals that carbonate away from the organism. So instead of the organisms be able to use calcium and carbonate to make the calcium carbonate, the carbonate is kind of sequestered off a little bit. But the main theme that you need to know here is that this is the result of the excess carbonic acid in the ocean. So this is part of that same question that we looked at before. C says, changes in pH of the world's oceans pose a risk to many marine organisms. Explain why certain organisms, in particular those with calcium carbonate shells or exoskeletons, are threatened by the decreasing pH levels measured in seawater. So if I am a coral reef, or if I am a bivalve mollusk, and I am trying to get calcium carbonate to build my shell up, that ability is lessened because of the ocean acidification. So the answers to this would be, this is worth 2 points. 1 point for correctly explaining the impact of a decrease in pH on shells or exoskeletons, and 1 point for an impact on the survival of the organisms. So you could say the decrease in the pH caused the shells to dissolve, and it's hard for them to add new growth or new calcium carbonate onto their shells. What does that matter? Well, it makes them less healthy. They're more at risk for predation or disease. They're not living optimally. So ocean acidification damages coral because acidification makes it difficult for them to form shells due to that loss of calcium carbonate. And just like with the other phenomenon in the ocean, there are some severe economic impacts. And this is an interesting clip from a family of oyster farmers and how ocean acidification is impacting their business.
Cousins. Our dads are Bill Taylor and Paul Taylor, and they run Taylor Shellfish.
And I'm Brittany Taylor, and this is Deani Taylor.
That too.
And we're the 5th generation of our family to work for our family business. I really take pride in the fact that our company is part of a big community, and it's very family-like. We have many families, not only mine, but many other families that have their whole families that work for us.
The ocean is so acidic that it is dissolving the shell of our baby oysters. Our farm is what has kept this family together. It's our glue. I can't imagine it would be devastating to lose that, such a big part of our history. When we started farming oysters over 100 years ago, we relied on the natural reproduction of oysters in the bay to occur in order to get our oysters. But as the industry has changed, we started cultivating our own oyster larvae, our own baby oysters. So when we started doing that, we needed something like our hatchery, which is kind of like a greenhouse where you can raise up the baby shellfish and the baby oysters to get big enough so that we can go and plant them on our beaches.
It took us a while to figure out what was happening in our hatcheries relating to ocean acidification, just because there's so many different things that can happen to make seed not survive. One of the things the hatcheries realized was that the clams and oysters were having problems forming their shell. So that made them look at the pH levels, because that kind of accounts for it. Shellfish.
So we're going to pause there and feel free to watch the rest of it. It's really a great end of the clip. But clearly, ocean acidification is having an economic impact on this family's livelihood, on this business.
Which is very vulnerable when it's first.
So let's do a quick check for some understanding. So which of the following events would most likely lead to a decrease in the pH in the oceans? So hopefully you pick C, an increase in burning fossil fuels in power plants. Please make note of the word burning. A piece of coal by itself, just sitting there, is not going to decrease the pH in oceans. But if that coal is combusted and creates carbon dioxide, that's going to get into the ocean, cause carbonic acid, and drop the pH. So be sure that if you're talking about fossil fuel use, being kind of implicating that into an environmental problem, be sure you talk about the burning of the fossil fuel, coal, oil, or natural gas. Next question, coral bleaching can be hazardous to some fish species because... And the answer to that would be A, big habitat for fish. So in summary, here's where we wanted to go today. We wanted to talk about ocean warming, and we wanted to talk about ocean acidification and practice these two skills. Scientific experiments we did through looking at Dr. Palumbi's work on in American Samoa, and then concept explanation we'll look at now. So let's just see if we've gotten where we wanted to go with ocean warming. So we realized that ocean warming is caused by an increase in greenhouse gases. We know that that can affect marine species in a lot of ways, including loss of habitat. But in particular, we have this whole phenomenon of coral bleaching that could kill a coral reef, and then all the subsequent biodiversity and habitat that would be there. So knowing these things on the right, can we then do this thing on the left? Can we explain the causes and effects of ocean warming? Absolutely. So let's go to acidification. Let's do the same thing. So in order to explain the causes and effects of ocean acidification, we need to know that CO2 is involved here, that CO2 is creating that carbonic acid. And as more CO2 is released in the atmosphere, it's getting into the oceans as well. What activities? We didn't spend a lot of time talking about this because I know this is something that you've talked about before, and Ms. Fassler has mentioned it, but burning fossil fuels, vehicle emissions, deforestation, so the slowing down of the amount of carbon that can be taken down during photosynthesis and sequestered in large forests. And then finally, going back to our coral reefs and other shellfish, they have a very difficult time forming their shells. And therefore, we can explain the causes and effects of ocean acidification. So let's do an exam practice. So this again is asking you to do a concept explanation. So can you explain environmental concepts, processes, and models presented in written format? So you should be writing like you've taken the course, using appropriate vocabulary and depth of explanation. So this one goes again from more simple to more complex, kind of describing things and explaining things, and then explaining things in different contexts. Can you use what you know in a novel situation or in a new situation? So our task verbs, I mention this every single time we meet, but the ones that we're going to mention today are identify, describe, and explain. So let's take a look at this one. It says coral reefs are produced when corals acquire calcium ions and carbonate ions from seawater and deposit solid calcium carbonate to form their exoskeletons. Scientists are concerned that relatively rapid decreases in ocean water pH will hinder the deposition of calcium carbonate. The graph above shows the amount of CO2 dissolved in ocean water and ocean water pH, shown in parentheses, since 1850 and the predicted changes through 2100. Two parts here that I want you to take about a minute to do. Explain how an increase in the amount of dissolved CO2 results in a decrease of the pH, and explain why that's happening. So let me give you a minute and a half for that. Okay, looking at the time, it looks like I'm running a little short, so I'm going to cut your time a little bit. So the first question said, explain how an increase of dissolved CO2 results in a drop in the pH. So this is when we're looking for a statement like, when carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, it forms carbonic acid. Why is this happening? The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increased because of things like burning fossil fuels. B or D says identify and describe a negative environmental impact from the loss of the coral reefs. So let's go ahead and look at some of the answers. If I lose my coral reef, an environmental impact, not economic or societal, would be things like loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, decreased protection from coastal or from storm surges, and loss of a carbon sink. And then you can see the descriptions here on the right-hand side. And finally, it says, identify one environmental problem other than one due to ocean acidification or loss of coral reefs that affect marine ecosystems. So now pulling away off of coral reefs, what other environmental problems are associated with marine ecosystems? And you could put anything from overfishing, increased ocean temperatures, invasive species, the eutrophication and hypoxic dead zones that we talked about the other day, plastic pollution in the ocean, oil spills, mercury pollution that Ms. Fassler talked about. Note here, it says ocean acidification and loss of coral reefs are not acceptable because it said other than that. So just be sure you pay attention to the question themselves. So once again, we know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, reach us at the URL below, and that's going to become more and more important. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in for corals and ocean warming and ocean acidification. And I will see you next time. But before I see you next time, Ms. Fassler is going to talk about invasive species and endangered species. So check that out. Bye. Have a good weekend.